Welcome to Obsession Engineering. I've had a few requests recently to do more workshop-based stuff, fiddling around with motorbikes, like normal maintenance jobs and bits like that. And so today we're going to be doing a valve clearance check on a GSXR1000 race bike. This actually belongs to a customer of mine, Howard. Hello, Howard. He doesn't actually know his bike's going to be famous. So there you go, we're adding value to it already. There are two things I have done before we even start servicing that bike. The first one is to print out bits of the service manual. Now, Suzuki are quite good of not stopping people putting the service manual stuff on the internet. So I've managed to go online, and within 2 minutes I'd found the valve clearance adjustment stuff, and it's quite detailed. It has the actual steps and the proper clearances and bits like that, and it is always worth having correct information if you can get it. So we have that. But the most important thing I've done before I started today was put on my lovely warm Obsession Engineering hat and a nice warm Obsession Engineering hoodie. Yep, that's right, we're plugging the merch again. Get to the website, obsessionengineering.co.uk, order your merch, stay warm in winter. Right, back to the serious stuff. Because it's a race bike, it has already come with bodywork and stuff removed, which makes my life considerably easier. So I'm going to remove the seat unit, unplug the tank, and then we'll get into the interesting bits inside. With the seat unit removed, the tank hinges up on the bolt at the back down there, and it means I can get to the 4 items I need to unplug to remove the tank. The first 2 are these pipes. So one will be a breather, one will be like a water drain from the fuel cap. So we can just get a pair of pliers and just slide those off. So that's both pipes removed, and the next 2 items are the electrical connector for the actual fuel pump. So I tend to unplug the electrical connector before I unplug the actual fuel line, because then if anything happens and you get distracted, then somebody turns the ignition on, you don't get completely covered in fuel. And so the last bit to release is the actual fuel connector. Might go around the other side for that. So there is little tabs at the bottom of here by my thumb and my finger on the other side, and if I give them a little bit of a squeeze, I can release like the safety catch and then slowly pull the pipe off. Now this bike's not been run for a little bit, so there was no fuel pressure in it. If the bike is warm or if it's been run relatively recently, it's sometimes worth having a piece of rag around that, so if there's any fuel escaping, it doesn't go absolutely everywhere. Right, now I can take the bolt out the back of the tank and take the tank off complete. So with the fuel tank removed, we can see the airbox, which we need to take off next, but the airbox has a lot of electronics around it, and so we do need to take all that lot off. Now, because this one has a piggyback module for fueling and bits like that, there are even more connectors than normal, and so they do sort of all lay in about the right place. So you could just take them off and it'd all sort of fall back in the right place when you put it back together. But if you're not sure, you can take photographs of them, because the wiring will be different colours in different places for different cylinders, or you can go and write 1, 2, 3, 4 on them. And it is always one at this side, on the left-hand side, and it reads that way. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4 as the crank pin location goes. So I'm going to put a little label on those with a marker pen, disconnect all those, snip a few cable ties and bits off, and see if we can get the airbox off. Right, with the airbox connectors, like the top injector connectors, off and out of the way, the next thing we need to do is undo the fuel line that goes up to the top injectors, because we need to take the airbox top off, and this has the same connector as the fuel tank, so it's a little bit easier to see. So all we need to do is, like these little tabs, just give them a little bit of a squeeze, that slides out of the way, and you can literally just pull the fuel line out, he says, as he's struggling to get the fuel line to move. Trust me, in a minute, with 2 hands, that will just slide off there. With 2 hands on the go, that did come off nice and easy. The next thing to do is pretty straightforward. Screwdriver, screws. And I will admit, I have recently invested, after many years of meaning to do it, in a set of JIS screwdrivers. Now JIS is Japanese Industrial Standard, and that is the type of head that's on these screws. Now everybody says, oh, they're Phillips, but they're not. Phillips is basically the American standard that we adopted even during war times and stuff like that, to make crossing stuff over easier. So most of the world uses Phillips, the Japanese use JIS. So JIS screwdriver that fits lovely, and off you go. I mean, a Phillips screwdriver will fit. I'm just being tarty with my new screwdrivers. Right. Never seen this before on anything but this Suzuki, but you take all the screws out and you still have to then take these two bolts out that attach the fuel rails to get the airbox top off. So they're now off. Lift the airbox lid off, and there we see an aftermarket air filter and all the standard sort of bell mouths and bits sat in there. So the next thing we need to do is undo the bolts down the bottom of the bell mouths, the screw at the front of the airbox, take the airbox out. Right, the airbox is loose, but there's a last couple of little bits. That electrical connector needed to come off the back. There is a breather pipe over here at the back that just pulls off, and there is an electrical connector as you lift it under here, which I've already done. I've checked the air filter. It is brand new, so that is no need to take that off and clean it, and then we can just literally lift that out, put that out the way. Right, now we're getting into the business end of this, and it is quite snug in here. There's quite a lot of stuff. And in effect, what we need to do next is unplug the coil connectors on here, take the coils out, and we need to work out enough room to get the rocker cover off, which is going to be quite snug because there's quite a lot of plastic trim bits and stuff behind the radiator. And so I think the easiest way is probably going to be to lift it slightly and bring it backwards, which means we're going to have to take the throttle bodies off. So to take the throttle bodies off, what I'm hoping to do is just basically unclamp them from the engine and like fold them out the way, and it saves taking all the electronics off them because that's just faff. I have undone the throttle position sensor off that end because you're not going to fold them out with the loom in the way, and there was a connector to the top there, so that's out the way. And then under here, if we go down here, we are feeding that into a clamp that clamps two of the throttle bodies together to their inlet rubbers. So we'll undo this one quite a bit, do the same on the other side, and see if they'll slide out their inlet rubbers. Now that I've undone all the clamps, of course the throttle bodies will just do that. This is obviously cheating. So I undid everything and needed two hands, but at least you can get a good grip on the motor for the fly-by-wire. Give them a good pull. These ones did need a good pull to come off, so luckily they're off now. And so the next thing to do is put some rag in the holes down the inlets so we don't drop anything down there later, and I'm going to have a little wipe around the rocker cover so we don't get any dirt anywhere we don't want it, and then we'll start taking the electrical connectors off the top of the rocker. I got into stripping things off mode, so I have jumped the gun a little bit. Basically the wiring loom sort of sits down here. There is a connector for each of the plug caps. Press the little lever bit and just pull them off. Disconnected the cam position sensor. This is the most awkward piece of wiring. This is the wiring for the horn and something else. And it tucks under here and basically tucks underneath with this water pipe. So I had to sort of fight it back through the plastic cowl behind the radiator, took that out of the way. And I've actually cable tied the loom out the way a little bit up here so that I've got a little bit of space to work in. So the next thing I'm going to do is just wipe some of the dirt off around the rocker cover, and then we're going to undo 6 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Undo those, and then I need to be able to lift the rocker cover enough that it clears the cams, and then we can slide it out the back. So there we go, when we can just lift the rocker cover up, and it's got to come up far enough that it clears the sort of cam towers that are under here. So I need to get a reasonable height on it, so I'm going to have to keep sort of fidgeting the wiring loom out the way up here, but it will come out. I hope. Right, that rocker cover is being particularly stubborn, and so what I've had to do is I've had to nip into the office and I've traded in some man points for a look in the workshop manual. Turns out, and this is what I thought might have to happen, I have to drop the radiator down out of the way a little bit, and then the plastic sheet, like heat shield cover that sits behind the radiator, I need to take out as well, and then I can apparently twist the rocker cover through 90 degrees and then remove it. It doesn't actually show you a picture of this in the workshop manual, it just describes it in words. It's not at all annoying. Hopefully this radiator malarkey won't take too long. So it is bolts out the top of the radiator, bolts out to the bottom of the radiator where it mounts the oil cooler, and basically the radiator then just pull forward and there's a bit of flex in the pipes, and then you need to get this plastic like heat shield off. The only game with that is it like sort of locates like formed around the back of the frame here and pushes into some like little pins on the front of the motor down here, so it's located top and bottom. So in effect you've got to push it down enough to get the top out so you can then pull the bottom out, or push the bottom up far enough to... you've got to flex a piece of plastic that gets hot all the time. So hopefully this isn't going to break as I take it out. If it does break, it won't be going back in. Right, radiator heat shield removed. And so basically with that I had to push the top down enough to unhook that sort of lump out from behind the frame, roll it forward, and then it pulls out the bottom where these other pins stick into the motor, and then you have to wiggle it off the top of the radiator. But now that's out, we can get a bit more rotation on the rocker cover, which is in there, and then we should be able to take it backwards out of the frame. It has been a bit of a faff, but not broken anything so far, apart from my will to ever work on a Suzuki again. Finally, the rocker cover is coming out. In effect, what I had to do was twist it that way, so it's sort of this, the cam drive end tucked into where the heat shield would have been, and that allowed this end to pop out the frame, and there was still a fair bit of contact with bits of metal, but it has pulled out. I just need to find out where that seal's disappeared to in the motor, and one of the O-rings from there, and one of the O-rings from there, and then we can relax a little bit and actually look at the thing we came here to do. Valve clearances. So now I can get underneath the rocker cover to actually get in to check the valve clearances. We need to be able to turn the engine round so the cam is in the right position against the valve. And there are two ways of turning the engine round. We will start with the official workshop manual version. Behind this cover is the bolt in the end of the crankshaft. So what we need to do is take this little inspection cover off, and that will show us the end of the crank. And they seal on an O-ring, so when that comes out, we can turn the engine over, and there will be a little mark that shows us where we actually need to be to measure the clearance. So at the top of the thread here, basically straight up from the crankshaft in the direction of the cylinders, there's a mark for top dead centre, and on the crank there is a little arrow over here, and if I line those two up, the crank will be at top dead centre for either cylinders 1 and 4 or 2 and 3, and then we can actually measure some clearances. I nearly forgot something there. I was getting too immersed in the idea of only doing the valve clearance service, and then of course remembered it's easier to turn the engine over if there's no spark plugs in it, because at no point then is it trying to compress any air. So I have a spark plug tool. We'll drop that down one of the spark plug holes, and I'm going to take the spark plugs out. I am going to be fitting new spark plugs before we put everything back together, and with the spark plugs out the engine will turn over considerably easier. Right, spark plugs removed. Spanner on the end of the crankshaft. It is 14mm hex on this, and then when I turn this like this, the camshafts will rotate because I'm rotating the crankshaft, and what we're looking for is, put the tool down, that cam lobe wants to be sticking up so it's as far away from the valve as possible, so that the base circle of the cam, in effect this bit of the cam that you see over here that has no sticky up bit, we want that against the rocker arm, because then we can get a clearance between that and the rocker arm, the valve clearance. Now these engines have rocker arms in them. Older engines tended to have a bucket with a shim underneath it, and the cam pushed on the bucket. These push on a rocker arm, so in effect the camshaft is pushing on an arm that does that. And the idea is it creates less friction than the bucket because it doesn't need a hole to run the bucket in, and is a little bit lighter. And with the rocker arm, if you really want to, you can have a different ratio depending on where you run the cam on the arm. So there's lots and lots of that going on inside your engine. So as I turn the crankshaft with one hand, you can see the cam moving around at half the speed of the crank, because we only want the valves opening and closing once every 4 cycles. So the crank goes up and down, and every other up and down the cam's doing something. And if we look on the exhaust one over there, what you can see then is when the cam lobe comes onto cam, which will be about now, you can see it pushes the rocker down, which pushes on the valve, pushes the spring down, compresses the spring, and opens the valve inside the engine and lets the exhaust gas out. And then it closes again, and there you go, the system starts again. So inlet side's basically doing the same thing. It pushes on the springs down there, pushes the inlet valves open as the pistons are going down, sucks some air in it, then it closes the inlet valves, goes bang, and then opens the exhaust valves as the piston's going back up again, push the exhaust gas out. Suck, squeeze, bang, blow, there's your 4 cycles of your 4-stroke. So what I need to do is put the crank in a specific position, and then we can actually get in and measure the clearances. Little arrow pointed towards a little notch in the crankcase, near enough, doesn't have to be perfect if we're honest, and that means I can get underneath this cam lobe and this one over here, and I can get underneath them with a feeler gauge and check the clearance. Now the feeler gauge, if we sort of look down to this one, the feeler gauge officially goes between the base circle of the cam and the rocker cover. Now it would be possible to get the feeler gauge between the rocker arm and the valve, but officially you do it between the cam and the rocker because that gives you the correct ratio and gives you the correct clearance. For the next step, I need some important tools. I need a piece of paper with some numbers written on it. And all I've done here is written each cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4, exhaust side, and basically marked out where all the valves are, so that as I go through the clearances I can mark them on here. And then I need obviously a pen, and I need feeler gauges. And if you've not used feeler gauges before, it's just a very thin piece of metal in a specific thickness. So this is a 0.2 feeler gauge. It is slightly bent because it's being used a lot, mostly for doing valve clearances. So I've got those in a selection of sizes, and what I need to do is slide those between the camshafts and the rocker and actually see what clearance we've got. So in effect, that's a 0.3. Hopefully that won't fit, but hopefully the one the right thickness will fit, and you basically keep going up until you get one that doesn't fit, and the biggest one that fits is your clearance. So we're going to start with number 2 inlet cam because the lobe is sticking up, so it's nice and easy to get to. I'm starting on a 0.05 shim feeler gauge, and I can just slide that between the valve and the rocker, and you can see it pointing out the other side of the cam, so that goes in nice and easily. So I'll try 0.1 next and see what's the biggest one that fits. Right, 0.1 doesn't fit, but here we go. I've got a 3 thou, which is actually 0.075, and that's quite an easy fit. So that clearance is probably 0.09, just under 0.1 of a mil, which is intolerant, so that's happy days. So that's 1 clearance down, 15 more to go. So having taken the inlet clearance on number 2 and the exhaust clearance on number 3, I'll need to turn the crank again. So if I turn 1 full rotation of the crankshaft, we'll bring the next cams into play, and it's going to be number 3 inlet and number 2 exhaust. Having got the clearances measured on number 2 inlet and number 3 exhaust, I've turned the crank 1 turn. I've now got number 3 inlet open and number 2 exhaust open, and basically every time you turn the crank you're going to end up with different ones in different positions. It is fairly straightforward really. Keep turning the crank until you've got another set of lobes. Now that we've done the proper way to turn the crank to get the cams in position, I'm going to show you the cheating method, and this involves cable tying the front brake on over there and then dogging the bike into 6th gear. Right, with the bike now in 6th gear, what I can do is I can basically nudge the back wheel round, and bit by bit that'll actually move the crank. Now the idea of doing it in 6th gear is it gives you the best gear ratio so that it's easier to turn the engine around and a bit more controlled. So bit by bit we can see that's moving the cams around, and that's brought number 1 inlet into a good position, and it should have brought number 4 exhaust just about in position as well, so we'll just go a little bit further, and that's it. We can now get in and measure those clearances, so in theory we don't actually have to take the end of the crank cover off if we don't want to. So I've completed the valve clearance check, and conveniently everything is in spec. They're all basically at down right close to the bottom limit, which is relatively common because basically it runs quite if the clearance is small, but they are intolerant, so that is absolutely fine. Obviously for a video it would have been great if some of them were out and I had to take the cams out, but for my work, trust me, I don't want to be creating any extra. If you did have to adjust the valve clearances, there are certain things you have to do. You would put the cams at top dead centre, and then you need to take the cam chain tensioner out, which is this lump over here, and that removes the tension from the cam chain, and then you take the sort of cam covers off these plates, and you do them step by step so the cam comes up relatively slowly because obviously it is sprung loaded, and then once you've got the covers off, and obviously you can do them 1 camshaft at a time, then you can just slide the chain off the end of the cam, lift the cam out of the way, lift the rocker arm up, change the shim under the rocker arm because the adjustment is done with shims on these, and then put everything back together. Obviously you need the correct size shim, but you don't know what size you need until you've got that one out, so ideally you've got a box of shims already. In the workshop manual there is of course a system for looking at the timing marks on the cams compared to the time mark on the crank and stuff, and making sure you put the cams back in the same place. But if you are literally just taking a cam out to adjust clearances, what I tend to do is get a little bit of Tipp-Ex or a marker pen and actually mark the chain, the cam chain, to the gear, and you can do that obviously on both cams and bits, and then that's normally going to put the chain back in the same place so your cam time will be right. It's always worth checking in the manual, but that can save you a load of hassle. But I don't need to do that today, so what I'm going to do next is put some spark plugs in some holes. New genuine NGK spark plug in my spark plug holder. This tool is actually a Kawasaki tool that comes in the standard toolbox, and it's got a little bit of rubber in so your spark plug doesn't fall out, but you can just use a normal deep reach socket and then slot that in the hole and screw it in place. And then there is a torque setting for them, which is tight, because it has to crush the little sort of sealing washer on it, and then I tend to give it a good nip. You don't want to be snapping the spark plug off, but you don't want it coming loose, so I'll get my spanner on that in a minute and give it an extra nip, put all 4 spark plugs in, and then we can just put the rocker cover back on, which I'm sure will be moments of work. So with my spark plugs in the holes and the O-rings refitted on the little pair valve sort of pipes, what I need to do next is put the rocker cover seal back in place. So I've taken it off, I've had a wipe around here with some brake cleaner, basically some solvent, just to get any oil and bits off there. And round the little half crescents that are down here, that are slightly awkward to see, I've had a good clean up around there and made sure there's no old sealant in place around there. And I've also got the rocker cover seal, the rocker cover gasket, had a bit of a clean up around there to get any old sealant off it, and then I need to apply a little bit of 3-bond. Now this is like proper crankcase sealant. This is the only thing to use if you're sealing engines up. It comes in grey or black depending on your preference. I'm using the grey stuff, and basically what I'm going to do with that is just around these little half crescent bits that are down here, I'm just going to put a little thin smear on here like they do in the factory. I'm not going to put it all the way around the rocker cover. If you know the bike is prone for rocker covers gaskets leaking, or you've had a gasket leak before, you can put a little bead around the rest of the rocker cover. It tends to be the front that leaks down here because obviously the oil sits against it because the engine's rotated forward slightly. The back is very, very unusual for leaking. If you are putting sealant on, only put on a little thin smear. You don't need loads. And obviously anything that isn't sealing anymore, if it gets inside the engine, it can block oil strainers and stuff like that. So only use a little bit of sealant if you are using it. Then I have the rocker cover gasket sat round the, sat round where the rocker cover is going to sit, and I have a rocker cover. And so in the reverse of how it came out, hopefully this will be relatively simple. But it is snug, to say the least. I've got to keep an eye on the rubber seals that sort of sit on the top of the spark plug holes to make sure they don't fall out as I'm doing this, because they sort of sit better in the rocker cover than they do anywhere else. At some point it'll just sort of pop into place. Rocker cover in place and not too bad, a little bit fiddly. What I'm going to do now though is I'm going to go around here with a little like screwdriver or something and just make sure the rocker cover gasket is actually sat correctly in the groove in the rocker cover itself. Make sure the O-rings are on the spark plug holes and look okay, because you've got to make sure your rocker cover and everything seals up properly, because otherwise when you start your bike everything's going to leak, then you have to go through all of it again, and then you're going to swear a lot. So having made sure the seal around here is set exactly right all the way around the rocker cover, I've put the bolts back in and tightened them back up. There will be a torque setting, it's probably 10 or 12 Newton meters, but I tend to do them by hand with an Allen key. They are an M6 thread into aluminium, so it's quite easy to strip the threads in this sort of thing, and they are sealing on rubber as well, obviously on the gasket down here and under here. So there will be a bit of movement as you're pulling them down, so I do tend to do them by hand because you get a bit more feel before you pull the thread out of it. Right, the next thing to do is put the plastic heat shield back in, the radiator back on, the coils back in, all the wiring back together, the throttle bodies back on. Yeah, just a few minutes work, but it is, as the Haynes manual would have told you back in the day, undoing it is the reverse of doing it up, or the other way around. You know what I mean. I'm making good progress putting everything back together, and actually it's all relatively straightforward because whichever electrical connectors you undid, there has to be one to go back together. So as long as you don't have a spare connector, you're probably going to be okay, and realistically the connectors are all going to be in about the same place. I've made sure I've put the fan connector down here, and the horn connector that was also down here that we don't need, I've actually tucked down the side of the motor out the way, so it's easier next time everything comes apart. The heat shield is on, the radiator's bolted back into place, so the next thing to do is to get the throttle bodies back on. So what I'm going to do is pull the rags out, have a quick check down the holes to make sure there is nothing errant down there. We'll have a little spray with a little bit of lube, because if you've got a tight hole, a little bit of lube is going to help you to slip it in. I've also made sure the clamps are relatively loose, and then we can just fold the throttle body into it, and it should just pop straight in, although I'm suspecting it won't be quite that easy. Alright, so here we go and see how awkward these are to put in. And actually, with the clamps undone, it looks like CPR, but they'll go in a minute. If it comes to it, we can give them a bit of a tap, and in fact I'm going to. So, bit of nylon hammer. We're not going to hit them hard, and because they're pretty much straight, you can knock them down into place. Now all of a sudden they just fall in. So bit of a look round, make sure they're in at the back and the front. Happy days. Tighten the bolts up, put a few wires on it, jobbed. So once the throttle bodies were in, the clamps that sort of sit under the frame rail did those up. And the nice thing with fly-by-wire, because there's no throttle cables, you don't have to adjust anything. You literally just plug the electrical connectors back in, pop the airbox back on, screw the bell mouths back down, make sure you've got the bolt at the front, bolts around the edge of the airbox, connectors on, which are all numbered up, so they made sure they go in the right order, a couple of cable ties to keep it all tidy, and there we are, we're pretty much sorted. Don't forget, on the Suzuki there is a electrical connector in the bottom of the airbox, so don't forget to put that on, and your breather that's off here, and that's it. It is near enough done. Pop the fuel tank back on, job sorted. So that is it for the valve clearance check in the Suzuki. And okay, we didn't have to adjust anything, but if I'm honest, probably 3/4 of the bikes I do valve clearance checks on don't need adjusting, and it's worth just checking them for peace of mind as much as anything else. So even if you're not confident enough to actually take the cams out of the bike and play around with the shims and drop things in your engine, actually being able to do the valve clearance check could save you a lot of money. And then if you do find them out, at least you already know when you take it to the dealership what they're going to have to do. And if we're honest, some days it's just nice to go in the garage and fiddle with motorbikes. So thank you for watching, and join me again next time for some more motorbike fun.